Right. So thanks a lot for the invitation and for and for inviting me here. Only time I was in Vienna before was maybe 6 years ago, just before COVID, I think, going to Prague on the train and just having 2 hours to eat a schnitzel and drink some beer. So I hope I can make more of the trip this time. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about projected galaxy clustering and what the kind of information you can get from endpoint statistics. All right, so we're going to talk about mostly projected clustering, meaning the 2-dimensional clustering of galaxies that you get, for example, in photometric galaxy clustering surveys or imaging surveys in general, right? So what are the main properties of galaxy clustering that separate it from other probes of the large-scale structure? Well, ultimately, we would like to measure the overdensity of matter, right, and study that directly, but we can't except in very limited cases. For galaxies, what we tend to assume is that where there's more galaxy, there's probably more matter, and that tends to be a good assumption, except the actual relationship between the two is quite complicated, right? So we know that the bias relation is a complicated one that is not just linear. The other thing that is good about galaxies is that galaxies are mostly local, right? So if you're looking at the clustering of galaxies at the given redshift, you're sensitive to the matter over densities at those redshifts for the most part, right? And that will be important. As I said, the main source for this observable is photometric redshift surveys. So these are optical surveys where you don't measure the individual spectra of all galaxies, but instead you measure their flux in some broadband filters. So you get a really bad measurement of the redshift, but you can do that for all the galaxies. So you get really high number densities, but poor radial resolution. So you end up bunching your galaxies into redshift bins and just looking at their angular clustering statistics. Okay. The other observable that we will always, or in most cases, combine projected galaxy clustering with is weak lensing in its various forms. We know what weak lensing is, right? This is the distortion in the trajectories of photons coming from background sources caused by the gravitational potential of the intervening large-scale structure. Those sources could be galaxies, and then you need to look at the essentially correlated distortion in the shapes of those galaxies caused by weak lensing. Or also very usefully, you can do that with the CMB as well, right? So you can use CMB lensing and look at the modification in the anisotropies of the CMB caused by lensing in order to reconstruct the projected projected matter over densities. Okay, so let's try to think about what kind of information we can extract from projected clustering, always taking into account that we will, for the most part, also combine it with weak lensing, right? And what I mean by that is, in the traditional approach, you would look at the 2-point functions, the two 2-point functions that you can form with galaxies and weak lensing, where there's always galaxies involved. So this would be the autocorrelation of the galaxies themselves or their cross correlation with lensing. And so the key thing to remember is that galaxy clustering is local. And if we can measure the redshifts of these galaxies sufficiently well, we can imagine a toy model where we have some kind of Gaussian distribution of galaxies centered at some well-defined redshift. And in that case, if you look at the angular clustering of these galaxies, either in cross-correlation with weak lensing or in their autocorrelation, what you see is that the contribution to the angular clustering at a given angular scale, L, comes from a very well-defined range of physical scales, right? So you can relate, because you know how far away these things are, you can relate angular scales and physical scales quite well, or at least much better than you would for cosmic shear alone, right? Which is an integrated effect along the line of sight, right? So you're sensitive to all of the structure from the sources to you. Right. So having galaxy clustering allows us to recover the shape of the matter power spectrum effectively to some extent, right? Because we can again relate angular and physical scales. We can also do tomography because of that, right? If we know what the redshift of these galaxies is, we can actually then separate a given projected tracer of the large-scale structure into its different contributions at different redshifts by looking at the cross-correlation with galaxies at those redshifts. This is this idea of lensing tomography. The naive picture is look at the cross-correlation of galaxies with a map of lensing, could be CMB lensing, for example. That cross-correlation will be proportional to sigma 8 squared times bias. If you combine that with the autocorrelation in order to pin down the bias, then you can solve for sigma 8, and you can do that for all your different samples at different redshifts. Right? It's very similar, sorry for the joke, but it's very similar to what you see if you open up a Mozart Kugel, where you separate the CMB lensing map into all the different contributions at different redshifts. Anyway, okay, so let's recap. We said we can get some information from the scale dependence of the matter power spectrum, or in general of the clustering. So where's that information coming from? Is it because we can measure the BAO? I think that's very difficult to do, right? So what this plot here shows is this is an angular cross-correlation. The same thing applies to the autocorrelation of galaxies in a relatively wide redshift bin. And so what you see in blue is the actual shape of the matter power spectrum if you map a given angular scale to a given physical scale based on the mean redshift of these galaxies. But when you take into account that you're actually mixing scales within the redshift bin that where you can separate your galaxies, because you're mixing the angular scales, sorry, the physical scales a little bit, what you see is that the BAO, hopefully you can see, the amplitude of the BAO gets reduced by this mixing of physical scales. So you can measure the angular BAO, but it's never going to be competitive with three-dimensional spectroscopic analysis. What you can do very well, because you can cover very large volumes with photometric clustering, and because you have very high number densities, so you can actually beat down the shot noise, is to get the broadband shape of the matter power spectrum. And there's information there, right? So you have the slope at relatively high K, and then the turnover or the curvature at K of the order 0.01. So effectively the turnaround or the equality scale. So from that, you should be able to get an estimate of omega m and h naught, for example, if you just think about it in terms of lambda CDM parameters. So that's the kind of information you can get from the scale dependence. And then what we say is we can do tomography and reconstruct the growth as a function of time. And we know that that's in principle a sensitive probe of for example, different dark energy models. I just wanted to flash a work by Carlos Garcia, who was a fellow at Oxford and now is moving to Waterloo. I think this is one of the most comprehensive compilations or combinations of data, including weak lensing and galaxy clustering, to reconstruct the full growth history over 10 billion years. Okay. So what else can we do, right? So this is what you can get from projected clustering if you limit yourself to 2-point functions. Can we do more than that? So what information is there in the, for example, next order point function, which is the bispectrum? And how about field level from clustering? I will talk about the first one, and hopefully we can maybe discuss field level during the week. All right. Let's talk about the bispectrum. So why is it useful to think about the bispectrum as a higher order statistic as opposed to many of the other higher order statistics that exist, or even doing field level directly? Well, there's a well understood theoretical framework for it. We know how to make predictions for the bispectrum. Those predictions can be connected with fundamental pieces, for example, particular bispectrum templates or particular power spectrum templates that you can just emulate very accurately without having to emulate the whole survey, right? You can use those individual ingredients and then forward model them and add all the survey specific effects on top of them. So in terms of doing an efficient analysis, I think that. And then in terms of why is it useful, it should allow you to break important degeneracies, for example, between bias parameters and sigma 8. And just the fact that you can see if your measurements of the 3-point function agree with your measurements of the 2-point function, or at least if your 2-point function can predict your 3-point function, I think that's actually a very strong test of your model, right? And therefore of whatever constraints you get from a 2-point function analysis. Those are the reasons why to use the bispectrum. The reasons why maybe you shouldn't use the bispectrum is that most bispectrum estimators can be quite slow. The bispectrum is a kind of unwieldy thing. There's lots of triangle configurations, right? It's very easy to plot a power spectrum, but bispectra are a bit of a nightmare to think about. And also, the covariance matrix can be complicated. And if the data vector is large, the covariance matrix is going to be very, very large. And doing that from simulations can be very costly. So these problems where we try to tackle these problems in the context of the projected bispectrum in a paper led by my student Leah Harsquet from Oxford. We worked on this with Andres Losar, where what Leah did is develop this thing called the filter square bispectrum. It's very similar to the skew spectrum, if you're familiar with that, just with a small twist. So the first thing that you do is you take your projected galaxy over density. You can do this for any projected field. And first you filter it, right, on a given set of scales so that you only scales within a given set of multiples survive. Right. Then you square it. You square that field in real space, and then you correlate it with your original field. And that's what we're calling the filter squared bispectrum, or the FSB. So that you can show that it will be basically proportional to the bispectrum on that particular configuration. LL, so the filter scales, and then the correlation scale here. The FSB is mostly sensitive to close to isosceles bispectrum configurations. However, most triangles are actually close to isosceles, right? If you make this side too large, then it also becomes isosceles on the other side, right? And in any case, you can easily generalize this to any triangle configuration if you just multiply two filters instead of squaring one. So this is just one example of a more general estimator. Because we're using power spectrum techniques, which we have developed for a really long time and allow us to deal with practical issues like masking, etc., the estimator turns out to be quite fast and accurate. Masking effects, there's some residual masking effects due to the filtering, but they are actually quite small, and for the most part, you can neglect them. And I think the most important thing is actually that the covariance matrix of this estimator can be calculated super quickly. And that's because, again, we are now thinking of a bispectrum as if it was a power spectrum. And we've developed a lot of techniques that allow us to compute the covariance matrix of a power spectrum analytically, really accurately, accounting for all masking effects and survey-related issues. So I'm not going to go into the details of why this works, but it works. I'm just going to show you that it does. This is a simulation-based covariance where we used, I forget how many thousands of simulations to get a converged covariance matrix for the bispectrum and the power spectrum. This is the analytical prediction for that covariance matrix that you can get in a matter of minutes without using any simulation. And it works really, really well. We can discuss why later on. That means that this allows you to include the bispectrum in your analysis really easily. Effectively, what you're doing is you're taking your filter squared field and just adding that as another projected tracer of the large-scale structure, and you just look at all the auto and cross correlations. Okay, so what Leah did more recently this year is trying to do a first analysis of the projected bispectrum. So she basically looked at CMB lensing from Planck and projected clustering from the LRG galaxies in decals. And the idea here was to do galaxy kappa, and then include also galaxy and galaxy kappa measurements and see what kinds of constraints you can get from those and how the bispectrum helps. This is interesting because the projected bispectrum actually hasn't really been used before for galaxy clustering, not for angular statistics, right? It's definitely been used in 3D analysis, but not so much. Okay, so I'll just flash a few results. I think I might run out of time, but I'm going to push through. So these are the measurements of the galaxy and galaxy kappa bispectrum. You can definitely measure the projected galaxy bispectrum at very high significance, so over 40 sigma, and that's the purely non-Gaussian part of the bispectrum. There's a Gaussian part coming from shot noise. And then the galaxy kappa one is detected at lower significance, and there's not, for this data set, there's not much more information that comes from the galaxy kappa. So Leah focused on just adding the galaxy bispectrum to the. In this first analysis, what Leah did is just model things at the tree level, both for the bispectrum and the power spectrum. And that's a bit of a shame because that means that the power spectrum is only going to depend on your first order bias, but the bispectrum will depend at tree level on the higher order bias parameters. So what she did here is assume that you can predict B2 and BS, so the tidal bias and the squared bias from B1 using a coevolution relations, and then see what you get. And so the results were kind of promising. She could get consistent constraints on omega m and sigma it from any combination of bispectra and power spectra, and then adding everything together. So that was good, and then you could get an improvement of about 10 to 20% on the measurements that you get only from 2 times 2 point. I'll take this as a sign that I should finish. I'm just going to flash 2 slides. So what we're doing now, and this should be out hopefully in the next couple of weeks, is a proper analysis here where we actually go to one loop in the 2-point functions so that you can self-calibrate the higher order bias parameters from the bispectrum, right? And see how that helps you actually then constrain the cosmological parameters. This is something that's being led by Francesco, who was a visiting student from CISA, and Leah. So I'll just maybe flash the kind of main result, which is, or the 2 main results, right? So adding the bispectrum, the main thing that it allows you to do is to measure the bias parameters much better. And I'll show you how much better in a second. And that leads to a modest improvement in your cosmological constraints. So that modest improvement is of the order of 10 to 20% again, even though now we're going to smaller scales by adding one loop. And this is the kind of annoying thing is that if you look at the constraints on the bias parameters, they actually improve a lot, right? They improve by a factor 2 or 3, but that doesn't really translate into a much better constraint on the cosmological parameters. So with this, I will finish. So it's kind of puzzling, right? That by adding the bispectrum, you actually constrain the bias parameters much better, which you would think then should allow you to use the small scale 2-point function and the cross correlation with CMB lensing to get sigma at much better precision, right? But that doesn't seem to happen, or at least the improvement is really modest. So is it because we need to constrain those higher order bias parameters much better? So do we need better measurements of the bispectrum? Is it because we're limited by noise in the CMB lensing field? So we are planning now to look at weak lensing cosmic shear as an alternative. Or is it just that there's not that much more information over the range of scales that for which you can extend things by going to higher order in perturbation theory? But then this leads me to think whether actually field level will do much better than for projected clustering than adding power spectra and bispectra. There's a couple other things I wanted to discuss, but I'll just finish here. Thank you.